What if the most destructive forms of sin have absolutely nothing to do with personal morality, has absolutely nothing to do with lying or cheating or stealing or even breaking religious rules? What if instead the worst forms of sin happen when injustice becomes normalized? Because you see, when we talk about sin, we typically imagine individual choices. We typically think about something that a person does to another that hurts that other person. But the reality is much more complicated than that. The forces that shape our lives are not just personal. They are cultural. They are institutional. They are systemic. Now remember, sin is really all about dehumanization. And it's all about that moment that we stop recognizing the humanity of the other. And this doesn't just show up in individual behavior. It can become embedded in entire systems. And once dehumanization becomes systemic, in the eye of the beholder, it stops looking like evil and starts looking a whole lot more like just normal everyday life. Which raises a difficult question for us. What happens when injustice isn't just something that individuals do, but rather it's something entire systems produce? Think about it this way. Individual harm is tragic indeed, but systemic harm is downright devastating. Because when injustice becomes systemic, it no longer depends on one single individual and that person's actions to perpetuate it. Instead, the system itself begins producing the harm. Now, no one person in that system may intend that harm, but the outcome is still going to be there. And so systems become sinful when they normalize dehumanization, when they portray certain people as disposable, when they push entire groups out to the margins, when structures reward people while quietly exploiting others. And one of the reasons systemic injustice is so powerful is that it is able to hide right in plain sight, because culturally it becomes just the way things are. Here's a key part of the problem. Human beings almost never see injustice clearly inside the systems that they're benefiting from. When we inherit social systems that we didn't create, we grow up inside of them and we learn to think of whatever's happening in them as just normal. And over time, those systems shape our assumptions about the world. They tell us who matters. They tell us who belongs. They tell us who is threatening. They tell us who should be invisible. And history gives us plenty of examples of what systemic sin looks like. We have slavery, we have segregation, we have colonial domination, we have economic systems that depend on exploitation. In almost every case, large numbers of ordinary people participated in these systems without even being able to see that they were participating in and perpetuating all of this injustice. And it's not because they were somehow uniquely evil. It's just because the systems themselves normalized the dehumanization to the point where even if they did happen to see it, they were often unable to see it as a problem. And that's what makes systemic sin so powerful. It doesn't normally appear as cruelty, it appears as normality. And by the way, if this is the kind of topic that you enjoy, I want you to know that you are in the right place, because I make videos for progressive Christians, questioners, and the church alumni. And you know who they are. Those are the people who live on the edge of faith, whether they have left the church behind or whether they still sit in the pews. So if this is you, make sure to like and subscribe so that we can stay connected. This brings us to the topic of justice, and this is where the conversation can take an unexpected turn. Because you see, when most people hear the phrase divine justice, they tend to think of some form of revenge. They tend to think of like a punishment or settling old scores. But that's not really what divine justice is about at all. Divine justice is always about restoration. It's always about reconciliation. You see, reconciliatory justice is necessary when relationships have been damaged, because justice is the work of repairing that which has been broken. It is the work of rebuilding trust. It is the work of restoring dignity to all of those who were involved. And it is a work of reconciling people so that they can live together once again. But this reconciliation doesn't happen by pretending that the harm never occurred. It requires truth and accountability. And it requires a commitment to rebuild relationships in a different way moving forward. Without these things, reconciliation becomes cheap. And cheap reconciliation, that's not going to heal anything. Now, reconciliation can take many forms. Sometimes it happens between individuals, and we see this when people work to heal a broken relationship. And while it's fair to talk about reconciling between individuals as justice work, when we talk about justice issues, we're typically talking about something that's happening on the community level. You're typically talking about an issue that has fractured a community. So justice issues tend to address the injustices that have shaped the world that we have inherited. And once we've identified the inequalities in the system, then we can actually work to bring about necessary changes. And now these changes can vary. These changes may be economically related. They may be race related or gender related or sexual identity related or something else entirely even. But regardless of the key issue, anytime we're talking about justice, it's always important to remember that the ultimate goal is always going to be the same, which is reconciliation. And keep in mind that reconciliation, that does not erase the past. You cannot erase the past. What it does, though, is it transforms the way that we move forward together. And that's important because the systemic dehumanization is the sin. And the opposite of the sin is not just mere tolerance of one another. The opposite of dehumanization is rehumanization. It's restoring the humanity of the other. It's learning how to see each other once again, first and foremost, as people. I realize that many conservative Christians push back hard against the call for justice. But justice has always been part of the Christian story. When you look at the life and ministry of Jesus, you see that pattern absolutely everywhere. Jesus repeatedly moved toward the people that society had pushed aside. The sick, the poor, foreigners, outcasts. In other words, those whose humanity had been denied. Over and over again, the ministry of Jesus restored the dignity to the people that the systems had diminished or rejected. And any time the system dehumanized people, we see him step in and stand up for them, thus actively rehumanizing them. Which means that justice is not a political distraction from faith at all. Quite the contrary, justice is a natural expression of faith. It is what happens when love takes extremely seriously the brokenness of the world. If the deepest form of sin is dehumanization, and the deepest expression of faith is the work of rehumanization, then reconciliation becomes the Christian calling and mission in this world. We are called to resist dehumanization wherever it appears. We are called to restore the dignity of all of those who have been pushed aside. We are called to rebuild relationships that systems have broken. And as we pursue this holy calling faithfully, we have to remember that the goal of justice is never, ever domination. The goal of justice is always loving reconciliation. And that is not to say in any way that the work of reconciliation is going to be easy. In fact, quite the contrary, it's going to be extremely hard. But the reconciling way is indeed the way forward because that is how love repairs the world. Across this series, we have explored sin from several angles. We started with original sin, we moved on to how sin is weaponized, and then we redefined sin. And then today, we are looking at systemic sin. And if you've missed any of those previous videos, I'm going to link them in the description. Overall, though, the most important thing I want you to take away from this series is this. At every single level, the same pattern emerges. Sin is the pattern of dehumanization. Because you see, when we stop being able to see ourselves in one another, extreme degrees of harm suddenly become possible. But in the darkness shines the light. And indeed, the moment we start to restore the humanity of the other, the moment we start seeing other people, as those who share in our common humanity, healing becomes possible. Through rehumanization, the door opens for love to pour forth and rebuild our world. So thank you for taking time to listen to me today. If you've made it this far, please like and subscribe so that we can stay connected. I am Bo McGuffey of the Evolving Christian Faith Network. Until next time, peace.